Let there be light. My name is Jackie Van Dyke, and I'm so glad to be with you. Have you had a good morning so far? Have we fed you enough so far? After this session, you get lunch again, so I will try to not go over and maybe get outside and enjoy some of the beautiful weather. I don't know about you, but I feel like I have identified with every one of the women that we've looked at so far. And today we get to look at a woman who made a great sacrifice. But let me start with a story. Several years ago, when my husband and I were dating, we lived several hours apart as he was going to school in Illinois and I was in Indiana. And we were attending colleges in different states. And I remember one weekend I was greatly anticipating because it was the first time that I was going to get to go to his school and meet his friends and, just get a view of his life there away from me. He had this special weekend planned. He had arranged for me to stay with a family that had kind of adopted him as his home away from home. And I didn't have a car, but I did what you did back in 1991, and I had put up my ride needed sign in the cafeteria, and pretty soon somebody had called and said that they were heading to the Chicago area, and they offered me a ride. So it was all set, and I couldn't wait for that weekend to come. Now, unfortunately, this was in the middle of January. And even though Indiana doesn't usually get quite as much snow as we do here in Michigan, that Friday arrived with blizzard-like conditions. So my ride soon called and said, travel's not advised, so our trip is off. So I had to make that very disappointing long-distance call, for those of you who know what those are, to Illinois and tell John that I'm so sorry the weekend's off. A couple hours later, I got another call from John, and he said, hey, I'm coming to get you. Pack your bags. I'll be there in like 4 or 5 hours. So, I was like, really? Because you can hardly see outside. You're going to drive all the way here and pick me up, and then we're going to drive all the way back. Yes, that is exactly what he planned to do, and that is exactly what he did. Several hours later, he showed up. I, perhaps rather foolishly, put my stuff in his car, and off we went in the snowstorm. So it was an adventure, to say the least, complete with doing a complete 360 on a highway as we entered Chicago. Thankfully, there weren't any other cars on the road, but I'm sure anyone would have said we were crazy. And looking back, I would have to agree. In fact, I would not want my children to follow in our footsteps. And I don't think I ever told my parents the details of that adventure that we went on. Hopefully I'm safe now, some 30-some years later. But here's the point. Love can inspire you to do outrageous things. And the woman that we are going to look at next in this story had a love for Jesus that motivated an extravagant gift. One account is in Mark chapter 14. So let's read this together. Mark 14, 3-9. It says this, and while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at a table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Here we are, 2,000 years later, some 6,000 miles away, and we are still remembering what she did. We're learning from it, just like Jesus said. We're going to look at this in 3 parts. We're going to look at the sacrifice of the woman. And then we're going to look at the disapproval of the disciples and then the approval of Jesus. So the setting here, and We put this together through some of the accounts in other Gospels, but the setting was in Bethany. This is where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived. In fact, although this text doesn't name her, the Gospel of John tells a strikingly similar story, and it names her as Mary, the sister of Martha, the one that was sitting at Jesus' feet while her sister served. And John's Gospel also tells us that Martha, ever that faithful helper, was also serving this dinner, while Mary, once again, was sitting at the feet of Jesus in worship. How she loved him. So the timing was the week before the crucifixion, and this is important because Jesus' days on earth were numbered. Tension was rising between Jesus and the religious leaders, and it was palpable as they neared the time of the Passover. Let's look at the sacrifice this woman made. It says that Jesus was reclining at the table, which was how they ate. He was having dinner with some friends, and we're told this woman came with an alabaster flask of pure nard. Nard was an expensive luxury item. It was imported from India. It was a fragrant perfume. It was the best you could get. And it was used specifically for anointing the dead. And we don't know why Mary had this. Did she go out and buy it specifically for this occasion? Very likely it was an inheritance or perhaps even her dowry. Whatever the original intent, Mary saw the opportunity she had in that moment, and there was nothing and no one more worthwhile upon whom to lavish her gift. One thing is certain, this was a costly gift. 300 denarii was worth a year's wages of a laborer. Think of that, what that would be in our currency today. Right? Tens of thousands of dollars in one delicate and beautiful bottle, which in one extravagant act of worship was broken and poured out on Jesus. Great love compels extravagant actions. Great love compels extravagant actions. These are actions that lack restraint. They're beyond what seem reasonable, shocking, outrageous. This kind of love doesn't care for the safe, measured approach. It goes all out, not concerned with what other people are going to think, but only concerned to please the one that you love. For a visual of this, think of a man in a crowded place with a big, goofy grin on his face, and he's holding up a sign that says, "Will you marry me?" He is not concerned in that moment what anybody else thinks. He's not worried about making a fool of himself. Well, John tells us the effect of this perfume. It says that the fragrance permeated the room. No one escaped the effect of her actions because extravagant love gets the attention of others. And notice, she didn't just dole out a few drops, which certainly would have produced plenty of fragrance. No, in one decisive and irreversible action, she broke that bottle. She couldn't go back and maybe use half, pour out a little now and save the rest for later. No, that flask was never to be used again. And she poured it over his head as you would a king. In fact, in this act of anointing him, she was declaring her faith in Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ. Those words, Messiah in Hebrew and Christ in the Greek, literally mean anointed one. And the Gospel of John also tells us that she also poured it on his feet. So as you imagine this picture, imagine the love that she demonstrated. Think with me, what sacrifice has love for Jesus compelled you to make? What sacrifice has love for Jesus compelled you to make? Have you given something up? Have you poured out time or energy? How has following Jesus changed the value of something you hold dear and motivated you to sacrifice it for him? Well, there is a striking contrast between this woman's gift of love and the response of those in the room, which was indignation. Now, Matthew's account names them as the disciples, and John calls out Judas specifically. So So let's look at this disapproval of the disciples. Verse 4 says that some said to themselves indignantly, but I think not so subtly, right? This was intended for everybody to hear. And they were saying, what a waste. Why'd she do that? Surely there could have been a better use. Think of how much she could have sold that for. That money could have done a lot of good for the poor. Extravagant sacrifice will often be misunderstood or even disparaged by others. Will often be misunderstood or even disparaged by others. It might be looked down upon, it might be belittled or questioned, possibly even by those who seem closest to Jesus. These disciples who had lived and walked with Jesus for 3 years now feigned concern for the poor as their reason for indignation. Again, John fills in some details and tells us that Judas was a thief. He was actually helping himself to the money bag. He didn't care about the poor. He cared only about his own financial gain. Can you imagine Mary's tender and sensitive heart making this exorbitant gift in this pure devotion to Jesus only to be scolded by Jesus' closest friends? And we can't miss the implication of their objection. Why would you waste such a valuable item on him? Can you imagine saying that anything done for Jesus was a waste? It wasn't worth it? And yet, is that not what our actions say when we hesitate to give him our all? Something else is more important. Something else is a greater priority. Something else is worth more to us. To the disciples, this gift didn't make sense. The money could have been used better. It could have taken care of a real problem. But sacrifice is rarely expedient. It isn't practical, sensible, efficient, convenient, inexpensive, or advantageous. It's not easy, and it doesn't fit neatly into my schedule. But to this woman, there was no greater cause, no person to whom she would rather give her treasure. To her, Jesus was worthy of it all. That's actually the meaning of worship. It's from the Old English word worth-ship. Jesus understood the meaning behind what she was doing, and he didn't stop her because he was and is God in flesh, the only one who deserves our utmost worship and complete devotion. And Mary did not give this gift for the kudos of those in the room. I have to think she barely noticed the people around because her eyes were so focused on this one she adored. Her heart was set on him alone, and it was he who gave her the approval that she desired. Let's look at the approval of Jesus. Jesus saw the heart behind this gift, and he quickly came to her defense. Verse 6 says, "Leave her alone. Why do you bother her? She has done a beautiful thing to me." This word beautiful means honorable, fitting, noble, or praiseworthy. He commended her sacrifice, and then he commissioned her story. Jesus holds a sacrificial heart in high esteem. And Jesus came to her defense just like he comes to yours and to mine every time we go out of our way to sacrifice out of worship and love for him. She poured out her treasure as a tangible demonstration of her love, and she received the approval she was after. Whose approval are you seeking? Whose approval are you seeking? Are you looking for it from those around you? Or are you living to hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant," when one day you see Jesus face to face? Listen to what Paul said to the Galatians. He said, "Obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant." And let's look at Jesus' rebuke for the disciples. Verse 7, he said, "For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. Good deeds cannot replace worship. We saw that earlier with Mary and Martha. Good deeds cannot replace worship. Of all people, Jesus was not indifferent to the poor. He was so full of compassion. He spent his ministry helping and healing and feeding, but he saw through the disciples' motives. Hey, Judas, since when did helping the poor become your driving passion? Right? You can help the poor, Judas, any day of the week. It was probably implying that this wasn't a real high priority. But this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Mary, and time was of the essence. Jesus was not going to be around much longer. This woman may have been one of the few who had listened and paid attention as Jesus had warned of his coming death. She's preparing my body for burial, he said. Did she know how close that was at hand? When you died a criminal's death of crucifixion, you did not get the honor of having a proper preparation for burial. And Jesus knew the type of death he would suffer. This was all the preparation he would receive. Mary showed her faith in Jesus first by believing what he said, and then by offering her valuable treasure. And it was not a waste, because no gift to Jesus is ever wasted. No gift to Jesus is ever wasted. The only possible waste is wasted opportunity. There is no way that after all was said and done, Mary laid in her bed that night and thought, I kind of wish I hadn't done that. Maybe I should have kept that for myself. Not for a moment do I think she could have regretted that decision. But can you imagine how brokenhearted she would have felt? The regret that she would have had just a week later as he hung on that cross if she had decided not to pour out her costly perfume. If she had decided the price was just too high, maybe she'd wait for another time, maybe when there weren't so many watching eyes. What opportunity is before you that may not always be there? What valuable gift do you have to offer that maybe you're just saving for later? Like maybe when I'm older, maybe when I have more money or more time to spare, maybe when I get stronger in my faith, I'll do something like that. What are we waiting for? Let's give what we have today, not what we hope to have later. And look at verse 8. Jesus says, "Truly, I say to you, the gospel is going to continue to spread long after I'm gone, and this woman's story is always going to be repeated with it throughout all time, throughout all of the world." What an honor. No gift to Jesus is ever forgotten. He sees and he remembers, even if no one else ever knows. Think with me about the influence this woman has had. She could never have known how her expression would impact generations of believers. And yet here we are today talking about her. And I am sure that notoriety was the last thing on her mind, but Jesus took her gift and he multiplied it, as he so often does. The gospel is our model for sacrificial giving. The cross was the greatest sacrifice of all time, not just because of the physical torment that Jesus endured, but the spiritual and the relational anguish as the Father's wrath fell upon his beloved Son for the sin of the world that he carried. 1 John 4, verse 10 says, "This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins." And I love Hebrews 12 that says, "For the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross." Sacrifice is the path to joy. Can you imagine the joy of Jesus' approval? How Mary must have replayed that scene over and over in her mind, just relishing that look of gratitude and appreciation in his eyes. Can I ask, what joy are you forfeiting by your unwillingness to sacrifice for Christ? What joy are you forfeiting? Are you not taking advantage of? In our breakout session later, we're going to go into more detail about what sacrificial giving might look like in your life and mine, and the joy that comes from living in such a way. Does the thought of giving to Jesus stir you with excitement? Or has your love for him grown cold? Great love compels extravagant actions, and the way we grow in love for Jesus is simply by spending time in his presence, getting to know him better in his gentleness and mercy, his love and compassion and forgiveness, beholding the beauty of his character. As we read about him in his word and as we spend time talking with him through prayer, enjoying an intimacy that longs for nothing more than his presence. Once you have tasted this depth of relationship and true joy, anything this world has to offer seems rather shallow and counterfeit. So great love compels extravagant actions, and a heart for Jesus leads to sacrifice as an act of worship to him. This is the path to joy, and this is the path that I long for each of us to choose.